So Shakespeare's gone to London, he's become an actor, and he's also tried his hand at writing. He's got his fellow actors to produce his work on stage, and he's got aristocratic patronage for his poetry. This is really the point where Shakespeare's career takes off. We have some difficulty in reconstructing exactly how he went through that transition from actor to playwright. But we know that some of the other writers of the time objected to an actor becoming a playwright. The theatre was dominated by Oxford and Cambridge educated young writers of great talent. They regarded the actors as merely their servants getting their work onto stage. So the idea of Shakespeare becoming not only an actor but also a writer was very unusual. And as we've seen, what that meant was that he wrote his parts for specific actors. He was closely involved every step of the way in the production process. But in understanding the development of Shakespeare's work and the range of his writing, it's important to remember that he is only one of a large number of dramatists writing for the stage. This is the time when the theatre really takes off as a profession. The entertainment industry, as we now call it, has its origins here. And what the actors need is a large body of repertoire. So it is that a large number of dramatists made their mark. We think of Shakespeare as some kind of genius standing alone, but that's simply not the case. Indeed, for much of his career, Shakespeare wrote plays collaboratively. He began by patching up old plays and working very, very closely with other writers. In the middle period of his career, he wrote most of his plays single-handedly, but towards the end, he returned to a pattern of collaboration. At the very end of his career, he wrote 3 plays, Henry VIII, The Two Noble Kinsmen, and a lost play called Cardenio. He wrote those 3 plays collaboratively with a younger dramatist, John Fletcher. He also collaborated with a rather good dramatist called Thomas Middleton. So it's very important to see Shakespeare in the broader context of the drama of his time. So who were these other dramatists? Well, when Shakespeare began, the towering figure was Christopher Marlowe, famous for his tragedies, for his poetry. Dr. Faustus, with the famous line about Helen of Troy, the woman of extraordinary beauty, was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilion? Marlowe was hugely admired, but he died young in mysterious circumstances, in a brawl in a tavern. Was it a brawl simply over who was going to pay the bill, or was he actually assassinated because he was engaged in spying work? Nobody quite knows for sure. But it was certainly the case that with Marlowe gone, Shakespeare had the opportunity to emerge as the leading figure in the theatre world. But soon rivals were coming along. In the late 1590s, a man called Ben Jonson began to write plays of great innovation in the style of comedy. Jonson invented a new sort of comedy known as the comedy of humours. In a way, Jonson's comedies had more influence on the later development of English comedy than Shakespeare's did. Shakespeare and Jonson knew each other very well. Indeed, one of the fascinating documents we have of Shakespeare's life in the theatre is the lists of who the actors were in Ben Jonson's plays. Here in front of me, we have a text from Ben Jonson's collected plays, which he put together himself in 1616. And the first of his plays, the one that he really made his name with, this new kind of comedy of manners, it was called Every Man in His Humour. And we read there, this comedy was first acted in the year 1598 by the Lord Chamberlains, his servants, that's Shakespeare's acting company, the principal comedians were, and then there's a list, the kind of thing we'd see in a modern theatre programme. And at the top of the list is Will Shakespeare. He's followed by Augustine Phillips, Henry Condell, Will Sly, Will Kemp, and in the second column, Richard Burbage, John Hemmings, Thomas Pope, Christopher Beeston, and John Duke. These then are the 10 leading actors of the Chamberlain's Men. Shakespeare's name is at the top of them. So he's got 2, maybe 3 roles in the acting company. He's a player, like all the others. He's also the in-house dramatist, writing 2 or 3 comedies or tragedies each year. But his third role may be to oversee and sign off the work of other writers commissioned by the company to put on plays. This sense of collaborative work is something that recent scholarship has enabled us to find out much more about. The most famous example of collaboration in the Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre was the partnership of Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher. Behind me is a portrait of Beaumont. Beaumont was unusually well born for a dramatist at the time. He was the son of a knight rather than merely somebody from a middling background like Shakespeare. He left university without a degree, went to London, initially trained for the law. There's lots of links between the world of the law and the world of the theatre at the time. But then, under the influence of Shakespeare, he became a poet and a playwright. His first play failed, and there was another young rising writer called John Fletcher, and his first play also failed. But Beaumont and Fletcher got together and wrote a play collaboratively for Shakespeare's acting company. It was called Philaster, or Love Lies A-Bleeding, and it introduced a new kind of romantic tragicomedy, and it was hugely successful for Shakespeare's acting company. Indeed, it inspired Shakespeare to shift his style towards a more tragicomic, romantic feel in his last plays. Beaumont died very young. He died just a few weeks before Shakespeare in 1616, and he was only 32. He really was a prodigy. Fletcher went on to collaborate again with other dramatists, particularly a man called Philip Massinger. And in due course, the plays of Beaumont and Fletcher were published in folio format, a collected edition of their plays, a kind of edition like that of Ben Jonson of his plays, 1616, and like the collection that Shakespeare's fellow actors, Hemmings and Condell, put together of his plays in 1623. Now, as it happens, a lot of plays in the Beaumont and Fletcher collection are actually by Fletcher and Massinger. Very few of them are by Beaumont because he died so young. But I think what's fascinating, if we look at these 3 bodies of work from the period, is that Jonson on the one hand, Beaumont and Fletcher on the other, provide rival models of authorship and collaboration. That's to say, Ben Jonson wrote a large number of collaborative plays, but he left them all out when he prepared the folio of his works for the press. And indeed, in the case of his tragedy Sejanus, he said that it had some scenes, probably of a more comic nature, written by another writer who was almost certainly Shakespeare, but that he would leave those scenes out of the printed text. Jonson's printed edition, he wanted to be the work of himself as a poet, as a kind of classical author. Whereas the Beaumont and Fletcher folio gives the idea of dramatists working collaboratively. Shakespeare, just as his folio was published sometime after Ben Jonson's, but before Beaumont and Fletcher's, he was in the middle. So he was in the middle, in a kind of in-between land, between the 2 models of solo authorship and collaborative work. He did write collaborative plays, but he also wrote a body of solo-authored plays. The history of Shakespeare's reputation has tended to emphasize his solo authorship, But recent scholarship, where it's been possible using computer programs to analyse the linguistic fingerprint of each dramatist in great detail, has shown us that Shakespeare's collaborative work was more far-reaching, more thoroughgoing than has often been assumed. So it is that certain scenes in the surviving text of Macbeth are by Thomas Middleton, and so it is that the collaboration with Beaumont's partner Fletcher is apparent in Shakespeare's late plays. You can actually work out which scenes were written by Shakespeare, which by Fletcher. Theatre, then, a collaborative art, a collaboration between the writer and the actor, but also between writers. We need to get away from that romantic image of Shakespeare alone in his garret with his genius. We need to think more of the Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre as being something like a Hollywood script factory, where many writers work together on a team in order to produce the best possible product.